Hello students, in previous session we have studied the uh, basics of Hyperledger. What is Hyperledger? Hyperledger is a blockchain uh, framework, and by using this framework the industries can design and develop their blockchain. So there are different components in the Hyperledger fabric. We have studied the different components in previous session also: peers, clients, then consensus, membership, service provider, chain code, and different types of nodes, endorsers, committers, and submitters. So this part we have studied in the previous three sessions, and in this session we have to study the consensus mechanism steps, and also we have to study the transaction life cycle in Hyperledger fabric. These are the very short concept that we have to study in this session: consensus and how the transactions are processed in the Hyperledger fabric. So this is the syllabus of Unit 5. So far we have studied what is Hyperledger fabric. Then we have studied the architecture also. Architecture is a modular architecture. The architecture is divided into the different components, or we can say parts: identity, then consensus, blockchain services, uh, policy services, that we have studied in the, and these components are pluggable means if we need the components, then we can add the component to the blockchain. If we don't need any component, then we can remove the component from the blockchain. So this Hyperledger fabric provides a plug and play features. We select the components as per our requirement, and we select the security mechanism also, cryptographic algorithm, whether the advanced algorithms or basic algorithms as per our requirement. So this architecture is very flexible, modular, and scalable, and portable on any kind of machine. So industries can use this Hyperledger fabric to design and develop their permissioned, or we can say private blockchain. So there is a concept of channels in Hyperledger fabric. By using the channels, group of participants can form their own permission blockchain, or you can say private blockchain, for communication among themselves by using the concept of channels. There are two types of uh, transactions: public and private transactions, that also we have studied in the previous session. Then we have studied what is the role of membership service provider. MSP provides the identity to the clients. The role of membership service provider is to provide the e-certificates to the clients, and if the clients has the e-certificate, then that client can join to the uh, Hyperledger blockchain, or we can say any channel in the Hyperledger fabric. So there can be different kind of channels. Different group of peoples can form their own channels, and these channels are private channels, and if the channels want to communicate among themselves, then channels can communication. And then we have to study the last topic about this Hyperledger fabric, how the transactions are processed, and the smart contract, how the smart contracts are executed in the Hyperledger fabric. And then after that we have to study uh, the Ripple and Coda. We will start with the consensus process of this Hyperledger fabric. So consensus in Hyperledger fabric. So we know that blockchains are updated via consensus mechanism, or we can say agreement protocol. So every node has to agree on the transaction, and if the every participant agrees on the transaction via consensus mechanism, then and that transaction is updated, that transaction is committed to the ledger, and each copy of the ledger on every node, that copy is updated through the consensus mechanism. So Hyperledger Fabric consists of three steps for consensus mechanism. First step is transaction endorsement, second step is ordering, and third step of consensus mechanism is validation and commitment. So first step is transaction endorsement. This process endorses the transaction by simulating the transaction execution process. So we know that there are endorser nodes or endorsing nodes. These nodes endorse the transaction and execute the transaction, and this process endorses this transaction endorsement process endorses the transaction by simulating the transaction execution process. And then after endorsing the transactions, after processing the transactions, that transaction need to be put in the sequence. We need to order. We need to order the transactions in a sequence. If the transactions are processed in proper sequence, and that sequence will be same on every node, on every pair, then each pair will produce the same result, and if result on every pair is same, then that pairs will agree on the result through the consensus mechanism. So our second type of second step in the consensus mechanism in Hyperledger Fabric is ordering. This is a service provided by the cluster of orderers which takes endorsed transactions and decide on a sequence in which the transactions will be written to the ledger. So there are orderer nodes. We have studied the concept of orderer nodes. These orderer nodes will decide the sequence of transaction, in which sequence the transaction should be stored on the ledger, or we can say blockchain, that is decided by this orderer nodes. So this is the second step of this consensus mechanism in Hyperledger Fabric, that is ordering. Then third step of consensus mechanism is validation and commitment. This process is executed by committing pairs which first validate the transaction received from the orderers. These committing pairs will receive the transactions from the orderer nodes. They will validate the transaction and then commit that transaction to the ledger. Commit means to store the transaction permanently on the ledger. So validation and commitment. Validation is to validate the transaction, and commitment is to store the transaction on the ledger. No. You can see the consensus in Hyperledger Fabric. It has three steps: endorsement, ordering, and commitment. So the steps are shown in the figure. Then we have to study the transaction life cycle, second topic of this session, how the transactions are processed in the Hyperledger Fabric. So you can see the steps. The steps are shown in the figure. So first step is enroll the users and applications. We have to identify the users, authenticate the users, and that authentication identification is done by the membership service providers, and also we have to identify the applications. Then second step is submit proposal to the Hyperledger Fabric, and after submitting the proposal for processing some operation, some transactions on Hyperledger Fabric, then it simulates the transactions and responds back. And after simulating the transaction, that simulation is done by the endorsing nodes, or you can say endorsers, and then that transactions are submitted to the orderers. We know the purpose of orderers. Put the transactions in the sequence. They will order the transactions, and after ordering the transactions, that transactions are stored to the ledger. So next step is sort the transactions. After ordering, the transactions are sorted, assemble the blocks, then create the block. So we know that whenever there are transactions, transactions are bundled together, transactions are grouped together, and the block is created. Then that is the assemble block step. A block is created and sent to the committer, and committer will validate the transactions in the block, and the ledger will be updated. So these are the steps for processing the transaction in Hyperledger Fabric. So we will see these steps one by one. So you can see the transaction life cycle steps. Transaction proposal by clients. The clients who wants to do some operation, that clients will propose a transaction. So this is the first step where transaction is proposed by the client and sent to the endorsing peers on the distributed ledger network. All clients need to be enrolled via membership services before they can propose the transaction. So we know that before the any client can propose a transaction, that client needs to be approved, that clients need to be authenticated by the membership service provider, and this membership service provider provides a e-certificate to the clients, and after providing the e-certificate, that client can join to the Hyperledger blockchain. And then second step is the transaction is simulated by the endorsers, which generates a read-write set, and this is achieved by executing the chain code. Chain code is nothing but the smart code, smart contract, or smart contract is nothing but the business conditions and parameters that needs to be satisfied before processing the transaction. So the chain code will verify whether the business conditions are satisfied or not. If the business conditions are satisfied, then that transactions can be committed to the ledger. So the second step is the transaction is simulated by endorsers, which generates a read-write set, and this is achieved by executing the chain code. But instead of updating the ledger, only a read-write set depicting any reads or updates to the ledger is created. Then third step is endorsed transaction is sent back to the application. Then fourth step, submission of endorsed transactions and read-write sets to the ordering service by the application. So after sending the transactions back to the application will submit that transaction to the orderer nodes, and orderer nodes will try to put the transactions in a sequence before committing the transaction to the ledger. Then after that, the ordering service assembles all endorsed transactions and read-write sets in order into a block. Ordering nodes will will put the transactions in the sequence. Then it will assemble a block if sufficient number of transactions are received, and it will put the transactions into a blocks and read-write sets and sorts them by channel ID. Ordering service broadcast the assembled block to all committing peers. Then this ordering service will broadcast this assembled block, the block which was recently created, and that block will send to all committing peers, and committing peers will validate the transactions. Committing peers update the transactions, and finally after updating the ledger, that block is inserted in the blockchain. The committing peers update the transactions, update the ledger means the block will be created by ordering nodes. Block is broadcasted. Committing peers will validate the transactions and blocks, and that block is inserted into that block is appended to the blockchain. Finally, after updating the ledger, the notification of success that the block is added, or either failure of the transaction by committing peers is sent back to the client. So client will be informed whether the operation is successful or not. So this is how the transactions are processed in the Hyperledger blockchain. So almost it is similar to any kind of blockchain. Only there are some concept, endorsement, then ordering nodes, then chain code. So these new terminologies, new components are there in the Hyperledger fabric. Otherwise, this process is similar. What we have studied in the very first unit, how the transactions are processed in the blockchain. That kind of method this Hyperledger fabric has, but only there are new components, new terminologies. New terminologies means there are different types of nodes: endorsing nodes, committers, sub committers, then orderer nodes, then we call chain code to the smart contract. And then for ordering the transactions, there is a ordering nodes, then committing nodes that commit the transactions to the ledger, that these committing nodes validate the transaction. So these concepts are only, and the terminologies are different, the terms are different, otherwise the process is same. So you can see this process is shown in the figure. The membership provide, which provides a membership. It provides a registration service. The clients or applications are registered to the blockchain by using this by this membership service provider. The more membership service provider provides a e-certificates to the clients or applications. Then these applications can these applications can communicate with the blockchain with Fabric SDK. You can see this Fabric SDK. Then how this SDK, these applications can communicate with the blockchain through this SDK. It will request to the endorser nodes. These applications can propose a transaction. You can see this propose a transaction. Then endorser will simulate the transaction. Then after simulating the transaction, it will return that transaction to the return back to the application. You can see then application will send this transaction to the orderer nodes. You can see this orderer nodes, and this orderer nodes will sort. This orderer nodes will sort the transactions. They will order the transactions, and then there are committers. You can see committers will validate the transactions. Committer will validate the transactions, and committer will update the transaction. And then after the transaction is committed, after the transaction is validated by the committers, then that transaction is stored in the ledger. You can see last step is ledger, and the orderer will broadcast the transaction to all committers. Every committer has to validate the transaction, every committer has to commit the transaction, and they will update their local copies via the consensus process if all the nodes agree to commit the transaction. So this is how the transactions are processed in the Hyperledger fabric. So this process we have studied through this transaction flow structure. So every application, every client can communicate with the blockchain through the Fabric SDK, and membership service provides a e-certificates or registration service to the applications or clients, and applications or clients can communicate with the endorser through the Fabric SDK. Endorser simulates the transaction, and it executes the transaction, and then it will return the transaction to the application, and the application will resend that transaction to the orderer. Node will sort the transactions. They will put the transaction in the block, and this orderer node will assemble a block. It will assemble the block, it will create a block, and it will put the transactions in the block. And after putting the transaction in the block, this orderer node will broadcast. The orderer node will broadcast the block to all the committers, and committers will validate the block, committers will commit the block to the ledger. So this is how the transactions are processed in the Hyperledger fabric. So students, in this session we have studied the consensus mechanism of Hyperledger fabric, and also we have studied the Hyperledger transaction life cycle. So this is the end of this Hyperledger fabric also. So in this unit we have to study two miscellaneous topics, like we have to take the introduction of Coda and Ripple. So in the next two sessions we will take the introduction of this code and hyper Ripple, and then we will complete this unit 5. So thanks for watching session. Goodbye.